showcasing some of our local talent. We'll have other talent throughout the conference, represented by various 4-H members and so forth, so we'll really look forward to that. Our keynote tonight, I have the privilege of introducing as Dr. Richard Lerner. For more than a decade, preeminent youth development scholar Dr. Richard Lerner and the team at the Institute for Applied Research and Youth Development at Tufts University have been working with faculty at land-grant universities to conduct the study of positive youth development. Lerner is known for his theory of relations between lifespan, human development, and social change, and for his research about the relations between adolescents and their peers, families, schools, and communities. Dr. Richard Lerner and Dr. Jacqueline Lerner and the team at the Institute for Applied Research and Youth Development at Tufts University, Medford, Massachusetts, are influencing research and practice around the world. Dr. Lerner will address the positive development of youth, comprehensive findings from the 4-H study of positive youth development. With that, please welcome Dr. Richard Lerner.
That's not it.
No?
Oh, there it is.
Does that look familiar?
So how do I do this?
Well, you can do that, or you can advance with that.
Which is that?
Those.
Oh, those. So, good evening.
Good evening.
So whenever there are studies in Massachusetts of the technologically proficient, I'm in the comparison group. So I hope I can do this appropriately. If you ask the typical American parent, is their son or daughter doing well in life? And we've actually done this research, as you'll see. The typical American parent would say, yes, my son or daughter is doing well. If you then ask, however, why? How do you know? What do you look at? What lets you know that they're doing well? What that parent will say is, well, other than for school grades, they'll say, they're not smoking, they're not drinking, they're not engaged in unsafe sex, they're not bullying. All too often, the adults in this society define good in adolescence as the absence of bad. You're a good kid by what you're not doing. What a dispiriting message. We just had a wonderful meal. Now, imagine if the manager of this hotel went into the sous chef and said, well, let's see if I'm going to renew you for another year. You didn't insult and humiliate the waitstaff. You didn't poison the guests. And you didn't burn down the kitchen. You had a great year. I'm going to renew you. What a dispiriting message. And yet, that's the message we're sending to the young people of our country all too often. That the absence of bad is what makes them a good kid. Well, I'm here tonight to give you a different message. A message that there are things we can point to in our young people that are markers of a thriving, flourishing young person, a young person whom we could be proud of. And this set of ideas that we can look at to understand what it means to be a thriving young person in America is the positive youth development perspective. So let me see if I can advance this slide. I did it. Very good. Thank you. So what I'm going to talk about is first, what is positive development and what are the key ideas associated with positive development? And I'm going to talk about why it's important to study the links between positive youth development, the ecology or the settings of youth development, and youth contributions to their communities and to civil society. And since some of you are involved in 4-H, that is everyone in the room, why this third question or this third focus is particularly important when we're talking about 4-H kids. Then I'm going to talk about why this link between positive development and the community and civic engagement is of interest based on the research that we have about these associations. And finally, I'm going to close with what are the implications of this research for practice and policy. So first, let me start with what we thought we used to know about adolescence. Now, I live in the outskirts of Boston, Massachusetts, and I work at Tufts University, which is in Medford, and which is pronounced in Massachusetts, Medford. So in Medford, we're right next to Cambridge, Massachusetts, and there's a small fly-by-night institution in Cambridge called Harvard. Yes, that's correct. Thank you for the translation. The first PhD ever in psychology at Harvard University was a student of the founder of American psychology, William James, was a guy by the name of G. Stanley Hall. And after he got his PhD in psychology, he said, I'm going to go way west and start a new life and start my own university and become its president, because just becoming a professor is not good enough for me. After all, I'm a Harvard PhD. So he went all the way west, 33 miles to Worcester, Massachusetts. And he convinced Jonas Clark, who was a button manufacturer, to start Clark University, and he became its first president. And he was a brilliant man. He invented something we use a lot of in our society. He invented the questionnaire. Didn't exist before Hall. He was the first person to study old age. He founded the first journals. He founded the American Psychological Association. And he was the first person to study adolescence. And in 1904, he wrote a book, a 2-volume book on adolescence. And he saw adolescents, young people, as reflecting the biological heritage of the species. And he said that when we evolved out of the sea, we began to be a creature that crawled out on the land, and then we made tentative steps to stand up and walk with 2 feet, and then we went through a period of great storm and stress and upheaval in our evolution when we moved from being primarily beast-like to civilized. And this is what he said was adolescence. We start as creatures in a fluid medium when we're in our mother's womb, and then water breaks and we crawl out on our stomachs and we crawl around as infants. We begin to walk. And adolescence, he said, is that period in life when we go from being uncivilized little beasts to mature adults. And this upheaval, this overthrowing of our biological heritage created great storm, stress, and uncertainty about the adjustment of adolescence. And this was his theory. Now, not many people took this recapitulation, that adolescence is just a repeat of our evolutionary history, seriously. But what they did take seriously was that adolescence was a period of biologically based, inevitable, universal deficit of problems. And the great theorists who followed Hall about adolescence, Anna Freud, who was Sigmund Freud's daughter, Erik Erikson, who was the person who talked about ego development, saw adolescence as this inevitable period of developmental disturbance. Many of you, if you know anything about adolescent development, you've run across Erikson in your college, and he described adolescence as a period of identity crisis, where you were confused and not knowing what you were going to do in life. Most of the research in the 20th century was based on this deficit model. Let me see, okay, here. But as early as the 1960s, as early as 50 years ago, people began to find data that did not support this view of adolescence. Are there problems in adolescence? Do we see problems during their people's second decade of life? Yes. But do we see problems in infancy, in childhood? Do we as adults have problems? Do people who are aged have problems. The fact that we have problems during a particular period of life doesn't make us special. It just makes us human. Adolescents have problems, but that doesn't make them special or unique. As we began to look at actual research about adolescence, these stereotypes about universal storm and stress began to disappear. Most young people don't have a stormy adolescent period. And those that do tend to be kids who had a stormy childhood. Adolescents spend increasingly less time with parents. In fact, research has demonstrated that if you ask adolescents, how would you like to spend your time? With your parents, with your friends, or alone? They'd rather be alone than spend time with parents. Most adolescents. But while that is the case, if you ask adolescents who are the most important people in your life, most adolescents pick parents. And if you look at not styles of dress or how they wear their hair or what their musical interests are, but at the core values of life, if you look at the value of education, the value of faith or religion, and the value of having a wholesome relationship with your family, adolescents end up having the same core values as their parents. And most strikingly, when they choose friends who share their values, which are the values of their parents. And so the friends end up being an extension of the socialization influences of parents. Nevertheless, throughout the 1990s, most research that we funded in this nation, you and I, paying into the government's research grants, was to reduce the deficits of adolescence, not promote thriving or flourishing in adolescence. And literally hundreds of millions of dollars were spent at reducing deficits. And there, as I list here, there are problems, but there was no attempt to promote those things that we could point to that reflected a positive, flourishing young person. One reason was we didn't have a vocabulary. We were talking about adolescence being less bad. But in the 1990s, things began to change. And they began to change on the basis of practitioner input. And what evolved in the 1990s was what's now called the Positive Youth Development, or the PYD perspective. So let me give you a very, very brief history of this perspective, tell you a little bit about the theoretical ideas associated with the perspective, talk about the key elements of this, and then give some examples of different ideas about PYD, and then show you some research, the research that we've done called the 4-H study of positive youth development. A practitioner, Rick Little, who was the founder of the International Youth Foundation, first introduced the concept of positive youth development. In his late 20s and early 30s, he went around the world and talked to the leaders of youth development programs across this country, but around the world. And he found that most practitioners disagreed with this deficit model. They said, our kids are doing really well. And when he asked them to describe what they meant by doing well, they described 4 C's to him: competence, and not just academic competence, although that was important, but social competence and health competence, keeping themselves healthy, fit, sleeping right, eating right, exercising. And vocational competence. 60% of all high school students in the United States who are enrolled full-time work part-time. So the workplace is an important part of the adolescent experience. So competence, confidence, a sense of self that I can matter, I can do something that's valuable and important because I feel that I have competencies, and I can do something that will be of value to myself, to my family, to my teachers, to my coaches, my mentors, my community. Connection, positive relations, with siblings, friends, parents, teachers, coaches, mentors, faith leaders. An understanding that in a complex world, we can't go alone. No person is an island. We're always in a social situation, and we need to have positive relations. And then character, a moral compass, a sense of integrity, knowing what's right and feeling that it is your passion to do the right thing. In 1995, the late Peter Benson, who I'll talk about again, who was president of Search Institute. How many of you know of Search Institute? A few of you do. I'll talk about it in a little bit. He organized a conference to talk about how to think about positive youth development. And at that conference, a fifth C was added, caring or compassion, a sense of social justice, a sense of saying that just because I have what I need to survive, that's not sufficient. I want to make sure that other people also are doing well. Rick came back and said, okay, if you're adding a fifth C, then I'm going to add a sixth. He said, I've thought about this, and it seems to me that if a young kid is competent and confident and cares about other people and is well connected and has character, that person should feel it's part of his or her meaning to make a positive contribution to their families, to their schools, their communities. And so he posited that the outcome of positive development of these 5 C's was a 6th C of contribution. And everybody said, that's great. And we all could say that's great because in 1996, there was absolutely no data. No one had done any research on this. The only data that was around was about the deficits of kids and how you can make them less bad. However, after 1996, things began to change. And by the end of the decade, Stephen Hamilton, who is with 4-H Extension at Cornell, said that the 4-H ideas of positive development that he had been concerned with had really morphed into 3 different aspects of the field. One, a developmental process, a process of how young people across their adolescence thrive. Second, it was a philosophy or an approach to how do you design a program to promote thriving in young people. And then it was instances of actual programs. 4-H programs, Boys and Girls Clubs, Scouting, Big Brothers, Big Sisters, that you could look at these programs and they were using a philosophy, which I'll talk about in a moment, of how to promote this process of development. So let me give you an example of approaches to PYD as a developmental process. And to do this, I have to bore you even more than I'm doing now for about a minute or two with talking about academic ideas of developmental theory. Today, we no longer believe in what most of us have heard about in one way or another of the nature-nurture controversy, that our development is either just blueprinted in our genes or imposed on us by stimulus-response relations from the environment. Today, what we think development involves is relations between an active kid and their world. The child, the adolescent, acts on their family, their school, their peers, their teachers, their community. And at the same time, the community and parents and families and programs are affecting the kid. And so we want to look at that bidirectional relation. And this is called relational, because there's a relation, development, because we're changing across time, and a system. It's not random, it's organized. And people have developed these relational ideas to try to understand positive development. So what is positive development? I'll go over everything but the last one relatively quickly. There's all of these levels of life: biology, psychology, sociology, culture, and they're all interrelated. And development involves these bidirectional arrows. We're affecting our family just as our family's affecting us. We're acting in our school just as our school is affecting us. And so we want to look at these connections between kids and their settings to understand development. And because the kid is changing and the world is changing, there is always the potential across time, or temporality, across time, for kids to change. And the jargon word for that is plasticity. But what we mean by that is that there's always some potential for growth, for making things different than we typically see them. And if we could change the way kids behave, if we could find ways of changing those relations between the young person and his or her world, we could be optimistic that we can improve human development. And if we can improve human development, if I can find ways that for each kid or group of kids, I can identify combinations of that kid's behavior and the programs they're in, the communities they're in, the schools they're in, I can elevate the thriving of every kid. I can improve every kid's life. So we could be optimistic that we can level the playing field among American kids and improve all kids' lives because of the application of these ideas. So we go from a very abstract idea of relational developmental systems to something fundamental about America. Liberty and justice for all. We can actually achieve that if we're good evidence-based practitioners. So this leads us to the 6 characteristics of the PYD perspective, and in a sense, you've already heard them. Because of this potential to change, because of this jargon word plasticity, every young person has strengths. That means if a kid has a problem, if a kid does have a deficit, if a kid is not thriving, we should be able, if we find the right combination of person and context, to move that kid forward. So the positive youth development perspective believes that every young person, underline every, has strengths. And all contexts have strengths as well. These are the resources or the developmental assets or the nutrients that are needed for positive youth development. And these assets are found wherever you find kids. They're found in families, and we'll talk about those, and schools, and faith institutions, and youth-serving organizations. And then point 5, and this is the key idea. If the strengths of young people are combined with these developmental assets, these resources, then positive development will occur. And we can, again, coming back to the idea of optimism, be optimistic that we can improve the lives of every kid. You don't bring kids into the 4-H program and say, well, that half of the room are throwaways. I'm never going to be able to improve them. I'm just going to focus on this half of the room. We all implicitly are involved in 4-H because we believe that if we do the right thing, and we'll talk about what that is in a moment, we can improve all the lives of all the kids we're working with. So let me give some examples of PYD. There are dozens of theories. I just picked a small sample. Bill Damon, Stanford University, he looks at the purposes of young people and says that if you want young people to thrive, give them a positive or a noble purpose in life. Peter Benson, the late Peter Benson, said that there are these assets. I've talked about them a moment ago. The strengths of young people and ecological assets, and what he said is we need to not only align them, but we need to work in communities to build the presence of assets that exist in communities. And so Search Institute tries to work with communities to find ways of making them more asset rich. Jackie Eccles from University of California, Irvine, she believes that to thrive, we have to help kids achieve positively, yes, in school, but in other walks of life, and that to do that, we have to make a fit between the developmental capacities of young people and the resources that we need to elevate those capacities. So you can't use the same program for an 8-year-old involved in 4-H and an 18-year-old because their developmental needs are different. Reed Larson, He believes that what you need to do is to use community programs to develop initiative, to make kids active pursuers, active selectors of the goals that they want to reach. And he believes that out-of-school time programs, things like 4-H, are essential tools for building initiative in young people. Margaret Spencer from University of Chicago, she looks at the constraints that exist, particularly among kids of color, on getting those resources that they need to thrive. What is society doing to unequally distribute resources, and how can we overcome that? Stephen, Mary Agnes Hamilton, they believe, by the way, if anyone wants copies of these slides, I'm happy to make them available to everyone. They believe that in order for kids to thrive, we have to enhance their transition to productive employment. We need to make sure that they leave adolescence and can be employable. And so they look at two things regarding to that transition to the world of work: transparency and permeability. So if we want to become a physician, or there was a young lady from the improv group who wants to become a vet, there's a curriculum there. You can go into high school and say, what do I need to do to become a vet? It's very transparent what courses you need to take. What do you need to do to become a successful stand-up comedian? That's not so transparent. But some people, we saw 4 people who might have that goal despite what they're majoring in. And permeability is, at least in America, anybody could become anything. Every job is open. We're supposedly a completely permeable society. But in other places, other kids feel that there are certain things closed off to them. So how do you deal with these two dimensions? And Hawkins and Catalino, or Catalino and Hawkins, they specifically look at the role of youth development programs like 4-H in producing a whole bunch of characteristics, and I've listed them here, some of which you can just see are associated with those 5 C's of positive developments, like obviously social competences with competence, and behavioral competence and moral competence. Ann Maston from the University of Minnesota, she studies resilience. She's our nation's expert in resilience. And what she wants to know is, how can we build positive development in the most challenged kids in our country? And so she looks at homeless kids, or kids who are growing up in communities that have high crime and high violence. And how do we reach out to those kids? And then George Clooney and Jackie Lerner, I always make that mistake. Richard Lerner and Jackie Lerner have a theory. Positive development is optimized when, not surprisingly, the strengths of youth are aligned with these ecological assets. And they look at different strengths of youth, and let me take a moment and describe them. One is intentional self-regulation. How do we control our behavior to get at those resources? There are all of those positive resources, mentors, and good programs. How do we get at that? Well, we first have to select positive goals. So that's selection. Then we have to develop the skills to reach those goals, or to optimize our chances at least to reach those goals. So we have to develop the strategies, or get to recruit the resources, things like other people or information, or develop the executive functions to go from our aspiration, our purpose, to actually achieving it. And then, quite critically, intentional self-regulation, self-governance involves compensation. We're all human. Sometimes we fail. Sometimes our goals are blocked. Do we fold up our tent and go home? Or, as in the example I gave at the workshop I did earlier today with my colleague Katie Greenman, do we act like Charlie Brown? And even though we know Lucy is going to pull that ball away, we keep at it. We keep trying to kick that football. And so how do we teach kids to persevere, to compensate? So selection, optimization, and compensation. Another key asset is hope for the future. Let's say you have the best selection, optimization, and compensation skills possible. But if you don't have any hope that if you use those skills, you will move forward. If you say, I'm African American, I'm Latino, I'm a woman, I'm developmentally disabled, and therefore my work, my attempt to reach my goals is going to be fruitless, I have no hope of succeeding, you're not going to use those skills. So we have to imbue in all young people the strength of hope for the future. And we have to engage kids in the key context of their life. So another strength is school engagement, being cognitively and socially and emotionally and behaviorally committed to succeeding in school. And we need to align these strengths with key assets in the lives of young people, say Lerner and Lerner. And they've discovered that there are 4 key assets. Other individuals, teachers, coaches, mentors, programs or other community-based resources like libraries, parks, opportunities for young people to work collaboratively on valued activities with adults, so partnerships with adults, and then finally having access to those people and activities and collaborations. And the idea is that when you put those strengths of young people with those resources together, you're going to get the 5 C's, and ultimately when you see the 5 C's, you're going to get contribution. So those are some examples of models. And so let me pick randomly, and I picked randomly one of these models to discuss further, and let's see what I came up with. Oh, it's the Lerner and Lerner model. I'm lucky. Okay. And so you already know this model. I've just spent some time explaining it. We talked about individual strengths and ecological assets, and when you put them together, you get, does this have a little, maybe it doesn't. Does this have a, no? What did I do? A pointer. Okay, you can see it. When you put those strengths and assets together, you're going to get PYD defined by the 5 C's, and then 2 things should happen. You should get contribution, but also risk and problem behavior should go down. Kids are so busy thriving, they're going to have less opportunity and less desire to get into serious problems. And this very complicated figure is a more technical version of what I just talked about. The ecological assets of individuals, institutions like out-of-school time programs, social networks, which is the collaborations between adults and kids, and access, and then the strengths of intentional self-regulation, school engagement, hopeful future leads to the 5 C's, which leads to contribution and in a positive way, and risk and problem behaviors in a negative way. And I illustrate risk and problem behaviors by depression, delinquency, and substance use. There are others, bullying, for example. So what have we learned so far? How am I doing? Good. Okay. I'm rushing through here, but I think I'll get through in another 15 minutes or so. What have we learned about PYD to date? So what we've learned about PYD, at least from the Lerner and Lerner model, comes from the 4-H study of positive youth development. So what is this 4-H study of positive youth development? Let me give you a little bit of an overview of it. First, we want to thank the people who created the 4-H study. Some of you may know that the past president of the National 4-H Council was Don Floyd, and it was his vision for this study that created it, that reached out to me and created the study. It was funded by the Altria Corporation, used to be called Philip Morris, and their vision, values, leadership created this. And I think it's useful for me to just show the power of Don's vision. This is a true story. It's not apocryphal. Early in 2001, I took a writing day. I was sitting at home. It was about 8 o'clock in the morning. It was a Tuesday, because Tuesdays were my writing day. And the phone rings, and it was my assistant at the university at Tufts. And she said, "Rich, some guy Don Floyd called up. Do you know who he is?" How many of you knew Don or know Don? Or know of him? How many of you know of him? Okay. So my assistant said, some guy, Don Floyd, called to speak to you. And I told him you were working at home, and he asked for your home number. Can I give it to him? I go, oh, sure. I'm a longtime friend of Don's. Tell him to call me. So about 10 minutes later, the phone rings, and it's Don. And he goes, hey, Rich, how you doing? Fine. He goes, look, I know you're a busy guy. I know you're trying to stay home and write today. I got a quick question for you. How much would it cost to do a national study of positive development in kids? I go, Don, what kind of a question is that? How many kids? From where are you going to get them? How long are you going to study them for? What are you going to study them with? What measures? He goes, details, details, details. Give me a number. I think he has a bet with someone. So I go, $1 million, Don. Because the biggest number at 8 o'clock or 8:15 in the morning I could come up with. He goes, thanks, that's just what I need to know. I'll speak to you, bye-bye. Okay. About 6 months go by. And it turns out I'm working at home again. It might have been the next time I was working at home. And the phone rings. This time, it's not my assistant. It's Don. He now has my home phone. I answer him, hello. He goes, hey, Rich, this is Don. I got great news for you. I go, what? He goes, I got you the money. In fact, I got you a little more. What money? For the study you're going to do. What study? Don't you remember I called you about 6 months ago and I asked you to give me an estimate? I got you $1.3 million. When can you start? I go, Don, wait, let's take a step. Start what? He goes, I want you to do a national study of positive development, and I got you $1.3 million. When can you start? Well, I've been in this business a long time. Not everybody calls you up at 8 o'clock in the morning or so and says, I want to give you $1.3 million to do research. So I go, well, I can start pretty quickly, Don. When can you get the money here? He goes, well, just come to New York, and I want you to meet the folks at Altria, and I'll give you the check. Meanwhile, I haven't told the university about this. I go, well, Don, you can't give $1.3 million to Rich Lerner as much as I'd like to take it. I have to file things, write things for Tufts because they have to accept the money. I'm not a 501c3. He goes, yeah, I know. Oh, and by the way, since you're writing something, I need a grant proposal from you. I go, oh, you want me to tell you what I'm doing? He goes, yeah, so write up a grant proposal and send it to me, and I'm sure it'll be approved, no problem. I go, when do you need it by? He goes, well, my board meets tonight at 5. Could you get it here by 4 o'clock so I could Xerox it and put it in the binders? Sure, no problem, Don. So he hangs up, and then, of course, I go totally ballistic, and I call up, and I get everybody on a speakerphone. I go, by 4 o'clock, we have to send 4H a well-thought-out proposal with a budget that comes to $1.3 million. And at about 3:45 that day, we send something off, and that's how the 4H study started. And over the years, Don added about another $6 million to that $1.3 million because the study got bigger and bigger. And this is a list of the people who have been involved in the 4H study recently. I call your attention to what is your right-handed column. Notice Jacqueline Lerner, Jarrett Lerner, and Richard M. Lerner. In my institute, our motto is, nepotism is us. So we have, Jared is my younger son, and he's our editor. He pulls together all of our publications. And Jackie is a professor at Boston College. So the 4H study looked at kids from grades 5, approximately age 10 to 12. We sampled a little bit more than 7,000 kids and 3,500 of their parents from 42 states. And we used a complex design. I won't bore you with the details, but what we did is we started with 5th graders, and when you get to 6th grade, those some of those fifth graders have been lost, they dropped out, but those who stayed in have seen the study questionnaire before. So we took a new group of kids who are now in sixth grade, and we gave them the questionnaires. Then when those two groups got to seventh grade, we did the same thing. We took a new group now in the seventh grade and followed them. And then in the eighth grade, so as the study went on, think of an inverted triangle. It got bigger and bigger and bigger, and that's how we reached our 7,000 kids. And this was intentional, to make it bigger, to control for dropout and retesting. In addition, we got a small gift from a friend of Tufts University. We got a small sample based on the 7,000. We got 700 kids back 2 years post-high school. And we've studied them 2 years post-high school. And again, of these 7,000 kids, 2,500 are 4-H. And Don wanted to make sure, because he was very prescient, that the kids in the study, we would call it the 4-H study because they were paying the bills, but he didn't want only 4-H kids in it. He said, I need to know how 4-H kids are doing vis-a-vis other kids. Because if we're not doing as well as other kids, I want to know that. So we, in fact, included more kids outside of 4-H than in 4-H. And that became important when we made comparisons. And you'll see that in a little bit. I'm going to show you the specific findings for 4-H kids. And I think, by and large, you'll be happy about them. But we only have those findings because we compared, in a very precise matching system, 4-H kids with non-4-H kids. And so that percentage of about a third or so kids were in the follow-up sample. So about, of the 700 kids we tested 2 years post-high school, about a third were former 4-H kids. So what did we measure? Well, we had to invent most of our measures because there were only these measures of risk and problem behaviors. So we invented a measure of the 5 C's of positive development. We invented measures of intentional self-regulation, the selection, optimization, compensation, or SOC that I told you about. We invented a measure of school engagement, of hope for a positive future. We figured out ways to measure the assets represented by individuals, parents, teachers, mentors, coaches, volunteers, institutions, mostly out-of-school time programs, youth-adult collaborations and access. We developed a measure of contribution, and as the kids got older, around 9th to 10th grade, we were able to develop a measure of active and engaged citizenship. And then we didn't need to develop measures of risk and problem behaviors. There was a plethora of them, and we just used the conventional ones in the literature. So what are our key findings? First, remember in 1996, we're talking about all of these ideas about the C's of positive development. The first thing we found is that, in fact, positive development exists. You can develop a measure of all of these 5 C's that you see, and that they all converge on an even more abstract measure of positive youth development. And consistent with our ideas about these mutually influential relations, we found that the strengths of youth are related to positive development. So intentional self-regulation turns out to be the single most important set of life skills that a kid can have. Selecting goals, optimizing them, compensating when goals are blocked. So intentional self-regulation predicts both positive youth development and contribution, and it negatively predicts risks and problem behaviors. If you have good self-regulation, your risk and problem behaviors go down. Hope for the future, same thing. Hope for the future also predicts positive things and is inversely related to negative things. Not surprisingly, school engagement matters for positive development and contribution. We measured these 4 ecological assets: individuals, institutional resources, youth engagement, accessibility. And we found, not surprisingly, that all of these resources matter. But here's the great finding, I think, and a finding that should be relevant to everybody in this room. In every setting, the single most important asset is other people. This is a great leveler in American society. Some communities have the ability to build fancy skateboard parks and to have libraries where there's a computer room where there's 20 computer stations. Other communities don't have any chance of doing that. But those sorts of resources matter significantly less than having caring, committed, competent adults. In all settings, other people, adults, are the most important asset in a kid's life. And if you look at the different settings, families, schools, community programs, the most important assets, the most important people in an adolescent's life are their parents. Good relationships with parents trump everything. There is no, yep, see, you're telling her? Right. She knows it. That's why she's sitting next to you at dinner. Right. I'm sorry to embarrass you. Good relationships with parents trump everything. But, and I think we would all want it that way, right? We wouldn't want that parents are insignificant. The next most important adult in kids' lives are program leaders. Caring, committed, constantly present program leaders. In fact, we found that there are 3 essential factors that, when they go together, promote positive development, and they're built on that mentor, that program leader. And I call these the big 3 aspects of program development. And as I describe them now, you'll see that this sounds like 4-H. And indeed, after we discovered this, we looked, and it corresponds perfectly with the model of youth development programs pursued by 4-H. The first thing you need, the first asset of an effective youth development program, is caring, committed adult. Now, again, you need that from a parent. But if it's not the parent, it needs to be a youth program leader, a mentor. Or it could be a coach or a faith leader or a teacher, but most effectively a mentor. But that mentor has to be capable, trained, committed, and available continuously. What that means is you don't want mentors to start a project with a kid and then disappear 3 or 4 months later. In fact, Gene Rhodes, my colleague from UMass Boston, has discovered there's a tipping point in the lives of mentors and kids. It's a year. If you break your mentoring relationship with a young person earlier than a year, that kid's behavior, whether it's a program around literacy or urban gardening or leadership or any facet of any 4-H program, if you break that down before a year, the kid's behavior will actually deteriorate to a level below where it was when you started the program. If you keep it going for at least a year, there's a tipping point. So you need to have that availability for a year. What happens in those committed relationships between a mentor and a young person? Life skill building. And one of the great strengths of 4-H is building life skills in kids. But we found, not surprisingly, that if you look across programs, the most important life skills that you need to build are, guess what? Those self-governance skills, like selecting good goals, learning how to optimize your chances to reach those goals, and compensating effectively when goals are blocked. And then the third part of an effective program, of a youth development program, is in the context of that committed mentor, armed with those life skills, you let the young person take a valued leadership role in valued activities, whether they're family activities, school activities, or community activities. You give the child an opportunity to shine as a valued, meaningful member of their community. You put that together, and young people will thrive. And we found that when young people thrive, contribution to communities, young people who are at the highest levels of PYD eventually show, as Rick Little predicted back in 1996 without any data, when young people have those 5 C's, they're going to contribute positively to themselves, to their families, to their schools, and their communities. And contribution is linked to ISR, hope, and PYD. All these strengths relate to PYD and contribution. However, and here's where things get a little complicated and a little bit dicey, the story of development across the second decade is not all wonderful. There are different pathways across adolescence and different combinations of positive development and problematic development. Your pathway through adolescence starts at different points and may end at different points. So, here from grades 5 to 12 are the different pathways that you see in adolescence. Some start off high and stay high, and some start off high, dip down, and slowly get up, and some are in the middle. This is across gender and across age and across the 42 states from which we collected data. Contribution. Again, there are 4 different trajectories that don't seem to cross. So they vary in their amplitude, but kids are going up and down. Things with risk and problem behaviors are much different. Look at that. So here's risk behaviors. Drinking and delinquency, bullying, up and down. Depressive symptoms, different pathways. But here's the complication. There are different combinations of positive and problematic development. We discovered that some people could have very high positive development, but also show risk behavior or problem behavior. And some people who show very low levels of positive behavior can also show low levels of risk behavior. There are different combinations. In fact, there's one group of people we studied across the United States who were at the highest levels of positive development and the highest levels of contribution. But if you look at their depressive scores, not at the level of clinical symptomatology, but just growing levels of sadness, there's one group of people who, despite being at the highest levels of PYD and contribution, their depression scores continue to increase linearly from grade 5 to grade 12. Do you know the name of this group of people? Anybody can guess? I admit it's a very esoteric group. Should I tell you? It's a group called girls. Anybody ever hear of that group? Now, for those former girls in this room, that is, for the women in this room, and for those members of the audience who are still girls, technically, maybe in the Q&A we could speculate about what's going on there. Remember, this is not clinical depression. This is just getting tired, sad that they have so much. My wife, who's obviously my co-investigator here, tells me that, well, all you're finding out is what your grandmother could have told you, that girls have to be better than guys, and it wears away at them. That may be the answer, but there may be other answers. So this is the findings for kids in America, undifferentiated between 4-H and non-4-H. But some of you have seen, we just published the final report from the study of 4-H. National 4-H Council publishes on their website. And we report the findings specifically of 4-H kids. And as you point to these findings, you'll find some things you'll say, oh, that's great, and you'll want to applaud and you should applaud, and others maybe not so good, and others neutral. But these findings have been convincing to the scientific community because what we did is we matched very precisely every 4-H kid in our sample was matched precisely at age, race, sex, religion, geographic area, urban, suburban, rural, every variable you can imagine, except there was only one difference between the kids, 4-H participation or not. So this is a very precise comparison. It's called propensity score analysis, if you're an economist or know anything about economics, we used this technique called propensity score matching. So here's how you have to look at these tables. 4-H youth versus non-4-H youth. A positive mean means 4-H kids are higher. 4-H girls versus non-4-H girls. Again, a positive difference means that 4-H girls are higher. And 4-H boys than non-4-H boys. Again, a positive mean means 4-H boys are better than non-4-H boys. Got all that? I'm sorry to get a little bit complicated, but positive means in favor of 4-H versus non-4-H, or 4-H girls versus non-4-H girls. It's always positive. And then I'll show you a comparison between 4-H boys and girls in a little bit. So here's something that may disappoint you. Overall, in this country, 4-H kids are not generally higher than non-4-H kids in positive youth development. They're about the same. When there are differences between 4-H kids and non-4-H kids, which you see in grade 8 and 11, they favor the 4-H kids. So when there are differences, which there are not a majority of time, they favor 4-H kids, but generally the takeaway is there are a lot of ways of promoting positive development. And that may be a hard thing to say in a group of 4-H kids, but you know, scouting is good, Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts is good, Boys and Girls Clubs is good. There are other ways of promoting positive development. But contribution. Starting in grade 7, starting from age 12 to age 18, despite the fact, and this is what makes that first graph so interesting, despite the fact that kids in 4-H are not generally more positive, 4-H kids contribute to America. 4-H kids are the kids who take a leadership role in making their communities better, and particularly so for 4-H girls. So from grade 7 to grade 12, the story is that 4-H kids shine in community contribution. I think that's worthy of self-congratulation. In risk and problem behaviors, this is one finding. Basically, there's no difference. This is, for those of you who know statistics, this is a chance difference. Basically, the conclusion is that kids are not different in risk and problem behaviors. Depression, 4-H kids are not different. When there is a difference, it's for depression for girls, and that's what's carrying these two. Non-4-H girls are more likely to be depressed than 4-H girls. So this is a good finding, but it's a trivial one because most of the time there's no difference. Engaged citizenship. We began measuring that in grade 8, and once again, it's girls. It's 4-H kids always better, and in most cases it's girls. Academic competence. When there are differences, they favor 4-H kids. But again, the differences are not systematic. But when there are differences, they favor 4-H kids. School engagement. By and large, there are not differences, but when there are differences, they favor 4-H kids. Healthier habits. By and large, there's not differences, but when there are differences, they favor 4-H kids. Number of adult mentors, same story. And then here's something that's interesting. SECT participation, science, engineering, and computer technology. In terms of participation, 4-H kids are participating more. It's not at least in, I gotta move quickly, I know. It's not really in terms of translating into scores in their actual test scores, because there's no difference in test scores, but they're participating more. And to some extent, they're not planning to take it as a career. Gender differences, if you look at this, by and large, except for risk problem behaviors, which boys are more than girls and girls are more depressing than boys, everything favors girls. So what are the conclusions and implications? I'm wrapping up now. There's relative plasticity in adolescence. You can start and end adolescence in different ways, but because of that plasticity, because of that variability, we can be optimistic, and we can understand that we can both promote the positive and also need to prevent the bad things. So we need to ask a complex question. And it's late at night, but let me tell you what the question is. We need to ask what characteristics of change in kids in relationship to what resources will lead to what outcomes for which kids, girls, boys, 4-H, non-4-H, through what intervention programs, through what portions of adolescence. But what we've learned is we know how to promote positive development and civic contributions based on those sustained adult-youth partnerships that I talked about. If we have the bedrock of skill-building activities and allow youth to lead these valued programs, we're going to develop positive development and civic contributions, and especially, for some reason, in 4-H programs. So what are the implications? My next to last slide. We have changed the way people are talking about young people. Based on the research and evaluation we've done, we've changed practice, because practitioners need no longer say, oh, I'm succeeding in my youth development program by making kids less bad. We can talk about the fact that you're promoting thriving. And ultimately, we hope we're changing the discussion among policymakers. Increasingly, the federal government is issuing requests for research on positive youth development, defined as we're defining it, not as reducing problem behaviors. Now, they're not putting a heck of a lot of money into it, but at least when they do request it, they're requesting it. So we've had an impact on practice, and we're changing policy. So here's my last slide. We can now answer that big question about social justice that I set out at the beginning. We could ask it, as I did a few slides ago as an academic, what actions predicated on the big three, that big three characteristics of effective youth program, for how long, with what youth and what communities, at what points in adolescence, will result in PYD and contributions. Or we could ask something which we should be asking in every program we offer wherever 4-H is offered. How do we use a youth development program like 4-H to foster mutually beneficial relations between healthy young people and a nation marked by social justice, democracy, and liberty, based on the fact that 4-H is the best program available to promote contributions to our nation? 4-H may be the answer to this question. Thank you.